So it was the last week of the Lords and a little bit of a roundup. One of the things that I thought that I'd achieved this year, the only piece of legislation where I made a massive difference, was that I put in an amendment that got rid of the onerous building safety managers, which would have cost leaseholders a lot of money. And I was ever so proud of myself, and everybody congratulated me and told me how wonderful I was, and I was the heroine of leaseholders throughout the land for doing that. And I've just been notified that what's happened is that all the freeholders have introduced the building safety director, a new role that is not legislated for, and guess what, leaseholders are having to pay. And I think the moral of that story is not to get carried away with yourself and think that changing the law will change society, because although the law can be used in the most regressive way to stop things happening, when you think you've made a gain, actually people will get around it. So that's one lesson from the year. On legislation though, an enormous amount of legislation, or a very important piece of legislation, is going through the Scottish Parliament today as I'm filming this, even if you're watching it a couple of days later, which is the Gender Recognition Act in Scotland, which is going to have the most far-reaching and I consider disastrous impact on women's rights of anything that we've known, and that it will mean that self-recognition is part of Scottish law. And it's sometimes difficult to imagine that Scotland is part of the United Kingdom, because this will have implications for the United Kingdom. And I think it's there that you realise that my role in the Lords is at least to draw attention to legislation when I think it's going to be a problem. And I'm really distraught on behalf of those campaigners who fought against that law, who've just been ignored by legislators in Scotland. It's a real disgrace, by the way, that the Labour Party, who are not the ruling party in Scotland, did not vote against that legislation, even though a lot of the backbenchers were unsure of it. And so I do think that even though the House of Lords is a limited place to fight for politics and changing the law, and the law is not the place where real politics happen, nonetheless, we have to make sure that we do our best to not just nod through laws that are going to have regressive and draconian implications. On that very thought, and this is, I think, very important, we arrive at the end of this year in a period in which everybody, it seems, in the public sector is on strike, or going on strike, or being on strike, not just public sector, but also the railways and so on. And a lot of people who follow this Substack, follow Inside the Lords, are irritated by the likes of Mick Lynch getting beyond himself potentially. Certainly at the beginning he didn't put a word out of place, and now he's some of the things that he's said recently have been irritating me as well. And I can understand that people get completely frustrated with the inconveniences that the strikes are causing, all of the things that people moan about and so on. But I'll tell you something I learnt this week from Inside the Lords, because I was trying to get in to speak on a question. And when you listen to the Conservative government talking about strikers in the most disparaging ways and threatening them with anti-trade union legislation, even though, in fact, in order to get a strike in this country, you have to jump through so many hoops, I really did think that it was important to say at this end of year time that the right to strike is hugely important. You know, there's a campaign called Enough is Enough, and I'll post a petition to sign which is against any anti-trade union legislation. And I really don't care whether you hate Mick Lynch, I don't care what you think about the RCN or the ambulance workers or anything else. The right to strike matters, because everybody who works in this country needs to be able to organise and fight back. And you know, it's frustrating to me that people who, for example, rightly were furious about what happened in lockdown, felt that people were denied their liberties, organised demonstrations and then were criminalised for doing so and demonised for doing so. I don't want that to happen to people who quite straightforwardly say, we organise as workers in this particular industry or area, and we want to be taken seriously. Because what's the alternative? That you beg whatever government's in to be nice to you, that you behave as though we're all welfare dependents and kind of go cap in hand and say, oh, please don't neglect us, and it's like a kind of sort of super furlough scheme where you're kind of begging for money. We're in the middle of a major economic recession, and the one group of people that is not responsible for that are ordinary working people, and they shouldn't have to pay. And as a consequence, if they stand up for themselves and use their agency to organise and fight back, even if you don't like the particular strike actions that are taking place, defending the right to strike and not allowing the government to remove our capacity to organise, I think is a hugely important message going into 2023. On a more positive note, last time I spoke, I was about to go and do a speech on the arts, and I thought it was really interesting because I did a speech in defence of the English National Opera not being moved north, not condescending northern people by some of the ridiculous arts decisions about, moving funding to the north, but in a rather patronising way, assuming all sorts of aspects of people in the north not liking high art and so on and so forth. So anyway, I made that speech. But the nice thing was that the person who moved the debate was a leading Lib Dem who I'd say is not one of my fans. And he did his roundup speech by saying, oh, well, I've had an early Christmas present because for the first time ever I've agreed with every single word that Baroness Fox said. And the reason I'm mentioning that was because you just knew that he thinks that I, as a Leave voter, a Brexiteer, some kind of Philistine, doesn't understand their arts and culture. And it was very gracious of him to say that he agreed with me, but it was also a reminder that what we should never ever do is label people and assume you know what they think based on those labels, but actually to listen to each other and go, I agree with that, I disagree with that. There's no point me just going Lib Dem and sneering either, right? What we've got to do is to learn that politics goes beyond those labels, and I think that there is as many people on my side of the free speech wars that get lazy, that call people woke and snowflake and all the rest of it. So my New Year's resolution is to take people on what they say, listen to them and engage with that, rather than the kind of rather cheap and lazy way of dismissing people before they've even opened their mouths. Having said that, we also are, as always, I'm afraid, facing a free speech crisis. Because of all of the ridiculous things to have happened as we build up to Christmas, we get into a situation where the nation is tearing itself apart over Jeremy Clarkson and a column he wrote for the Sun newspaper. Now, Jeremy Clarkson's comments about Meghan Markle, which was calling on a scene from Game of Thrones, and were particularly, crass and obnoxious. I didn't like them. I wouldn't have said it. But on the other hand, it was a column in a newspaper, and he is being treated as a pariah. It calls for him to be sacked. So it's cancel culture, and not just sacked from that, but he can't possibly present any TV programme. The Sun should be boycotted, according to some people. There's a hysterical response. Far greater threat to free speech, and a far greater offence to us all, actually, is that we should overreact like that to a column that we found despicable, even if we didn't, or we did find it. No matter what you think of it, the point is, it's just a column in a newspaper. And I've even seen people calling for greater regulation of tabloid newspapers. Anybody that defends him is written off as being some far-right activist, because obviously these days, if you support free speech, you're considered to be beyond the pale and written off as far-right. And that's that labelling again. But in all seriousness, the fact that it's created such a kerfuffle, it does indicate that free speech is not any longer something we can take for granted. And I think in that spirit, the work of the Academy of Ideas is ever more important for 2023. There are some people that I just want to acknowledge who've made such a difference in opening up the debate around free speech this year. And I talked about what's happening in Scotland with the Gender Recognition Act. So I want to say and do a shout out to For Women Scotland, who've been fantastic in their work. The bravery of the LGB Alliance, Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual Alliance, who quite straightforwardly wants to defend lesbian, gays and bisexual and same-sex attraction, who've been dragged through the mud and called all sorts of names and have really held their ground despite that. I want to shout out to Sex Matters and the work that they've done during the year. I want to acknowledge the work of the Free Speech Union, who've been incredibly important in providing legal resource for people who've been threatened having their jobs taken away. I want to give a shout out to Living Freedom and the Free Speech Champions, who've created a space for young people, particularly at university, young students who don't go along with cancel culture. And there's many other organisations that deserve to be credited, but just to say, it's important that we have solidarity amongst those organisations and really work together. And in that spirit, I'd like to give a shout out to Together, who have also tried to ensure that civil liberties are protected through their work post the lockdown period. But you know what we've got to do in 2023 is not succumb to a divide and rule atmosphere. We've got to work together and create a spirit of freedom and optimism, because you can be depressed about what's happening in the parliamentary system, amongst the political parties. God knows who you'll vote for, but politics doesn't stop with them. So it's very, very important that we build something positive and new. Just in terms of the Academy of Ideas, by the way, and this is my last word on it, I really have to say to you that we're always perpetually on the verge of, bankruptcy. We've never got enough money. We really want to carry on, but we do need your support, and we need your moral support, your political support, but also if you've got any spare money, despite the cost of living crisis, one resolution you can make for the new year is to support us. And if you're not a paid subscriber to our Substack, please give what you can. Just, it will mean such a lot to us, right? And also the charitable work of the educational charities, Debating Matters, Living Freedom and so on. Just, if you could, that would be brilliant. And I'm going to stop being apologetic and embarrassed about asking, because I always feel like I shouldn't be. But I'm going to stop doing that, because we need to survive, because the work that we do is something that we all do together, I think. And other than that, I can't wait for Christmas. I'm looking forward to spending time with my family, just relaxing like everyone else. It's scary what the challenges are politically, but I'm going to indulge in lots of box sets, lots of reading. I've bought everyone I know Letters on Liberty as stocking fillers, and if you haven't got them, then make it your New Year's resolution to read them, because if we're going to fight for freedom in 2023, we need new ideas, and that's why those Letters on Liberty pamphlets are so important to read and get on top of the arguments. It's been fantastic working with you this year. The final thing that happened in the Lords was that each leader of the Conservatives, the leader of the Labour Party, the bishops even, and the crossbenchers all stood up and thanked the staff who worked in the Lords, the security guys, the cleaners, all of the people who worked there. They named people who were retiring, one or two who had died, which was very poignant. They named them and they thanked them, and people have worked there for 38 years. In other words, the House of Lords could not survive without the people who work in the House of Lords. Hundreds of people who work in the House of Lords, who work extremely hard. And they deserve to be taken seriously as equals in society, which is why my final word is that working people deserve the right to strike, the right to organise, and the right to be treated and taken equally and taken seriously as citizens. And that's what the Academy of Ideas will do throughout 2023. Join us.